The Rebel Capitalist Show.
The debt jubilee. I think that's something that kind of everyone's been talking about. And what are our risks there? How do you see that playing out? Is that a reality? And if so, what are what are the risks that people aren't looking at?
Well, I think so. People tend to talk about debt jubilees in the context of, the Bank of Japan or high levels of sovereign debt, right?
Yeah.
But that's, just be very clear, that's a bit of a fiction, right? Because when you have a fiat currency, you have a situation in which the government is effectively maintaining a fiction that it's borrowing, right? So the central bank is buying those bonds, et cetera. They're not really separate entities, they're the same, right? When you talk about a debt jubilee, therefore, it doesn't make any sense to talk about it from the standpoint of a sovereign entity. It only makes sense to talk about it from the standpoint of the private sector, right? And that can include municipals like state governments, it can include corporations, it can include households. And the problem with the policies that the central banks have promulgated and that they've used to try to stabilize the system to this point is that it's led to an increase in debt levels while the income has not risen in a proportionate manner to service that. Mm-hmm. And so that sets up conditions under which, under a diffuse, effectively, that debt is not equally distributed, the incomes are not equally distributed. You're setting up a condition in which an increasing fraction of the population can't afford to pay its debts. Right? And the only solution to that is to get rid of them in one form or another. Right? You either transfer a significant fraction of the income and then allow the servicing of those debts, and that would be quite unfair to those who have paid off their debts, mm-hmm. or you have to have some radically different setup, right? And that tends to be what a debt jubilee is. It tends to be an edict that comes from the government saying those who hold these assets, because remember, all debt is somebody else's asset,
right?
They need to take a haircut, right? And that's societally, that's a very difficult thing to do. It can only come from the top.
Do you think there's a way to do that through inflation?
No, I think it's the exact opposite. So the problem is that when people talk about inflation, they're talking about lowering people's purchasing power, effectively creating conditions under which those who have first access to capital, who can go to the bank and say, I can borrow a whole bunch of money, they can have those debts deflated away, right? But inflation is perceived as a solution to this problem. It's actually the exact opposite, right? All it does, inflation just concentrates wealth. And again, we've had a very difficult story because what we're taught about the 1960s and 1970s is that there was a tremendous inflation, and that inflation, was super bad, right? Mm-hmm. Well, that was actually a very different experience than almost anything we've had in history. That was an inflation that was largely driven by an outward shift in demand. You had an explosion in household formation. You had an explosion in people who were looking for work because women and minorities entered the labor force following the advances in civil rights in the 1960s. You had conditions that created a significant outward shift in aggregate demand, causing prices to rise. The central banks interpreted that inflation as bad and so tried to raise interest rates to prevent those prices from going up. But what that really did was it meant that the supply function, those who were building factories, et cetera, evaluated those choices and said, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to build that additional factory, right? So and because we've misinterpreted, what's that?
So it constricts supply, which exacerbates the problem.
Exactly. That's what we did in the 1970s, right? The telling of these stories, when we tell them the wrong way, when we learn the wrong lessons from them, it becomes quite caustic to the policies going forward. And so we think of inflation now as being able to solve debts. That's not what it does. It means that the average household is not going to experience a wage increase that allows them to buy more food, shelter, health services, et cetera. They're going to be forced to buy less. And they'll typically be forced to actually find themselves with less and less assets as a result because their savings can't keep pace. It's not the solution.
Right, which just increases the inequality.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. So last question here. I know a lot of my audience is really interested in gold, Bitcoin. So is that potentially a way to protect yourself from maybe a volatile future, or are those asset classes just as risky?
So I'm not going to comment in significant amount on Bitcoin. I think that to me, Bitcoin is not particularly interesting. I understand why others are interested in it. Gold has historically been one of the few assets where you can own an asset and it's nobody else's liability, right? So remember, a bond is your asset and a corporation's liability. A loan for a mortgage loan is your asset if you own it, and somebody else's liability. They have to make payments on their mortgage in order to do it. An equity is your asset and somebody else's liability. A corporation has to deliver results that allow them to pay the dividend or repurchase stock or have results that encourage other people to buy it. Gold requires no performance from anyone else, right? And so it's actually a quite interesting asset from that standpoint and has therefore unique characteristics in a portfolio. Bitcoin attempts to replicate that. I'm less convinced of it, right? So I think that gold plays an important part in portfolios. We include it in our portfolios at Logica, but it's not an answer for society, because if everybody takes their wealth and plows it into a unproductive asset, we all lose in aggregate, right? So it may be an individual protection, but it's very hard to believe that it's a solution for the societal problems that we're discussing.
Okay.